So we can see that the grids bounce out, and when we go back there's no animation, but when we move forward we've got these grids popping out, which is quite a cool effect. So now let's also create that animation in this project. Rather than writing the animation code in the tile widget, I'm going to write the animation code in its own stateful widget, and then we can wrap around this tile widget and animate it. And that's mainly to stop this widget here, which is already quite large, from sprawling out any further. I'll create a new directory and I'll name this animations, and in here I'll create a new Dart file and I'll name this bounce. I'll create a new stateful widget named bounce, import the material library. Firstly, I'll create a child of type widget, and this will be the animation object that this animation wraps around and animates. So we want this to be a required parameter. I'll also create another variable, also final, which will be a bool, and we'll name this animate. And this will trigger the animation. So when we pass in true to this widget, the animation will run. And I've included that up here in the constructor as a required parameter. And now we have two required parameters that pass into the stateful widget. Now let's create the animation down here in the state class. Firstly, I'll create an animation controller which will run this animation. I'll set this to late because we'll initialize this in the init state, and I'll mix in a single ticker provider state mixin. Now we can sync that up with the controller. In the init state, let's initialize the controller. To sync it up, I'll just pass in this here next to vsync. Now we also need to pass in an animation duration for how long this animation will run. And let's put this at 200 milliseconds, so fairly quick, and we can change this if we need to. Now we've created an animation controller. We should also allow this to be disposed when we don't need it. So here I also have access to the dispose method on the state class, and I can just write animation controller.dispose. Now I'm also going to create another animation object, an animation of type double, and I'll name this animation. And the reason for that is our animation controller will run just from 0 to 1 while the animation runs forward. However, this animation object will allow us to animate between custom values rather than just 0 to 1. We can set in the values that we want. So now let's initialize the animation. Now in this case, I want the widget to scale up in size, and then once it's reached a peak to scale back to the original size. So essentially I want to run two tweens, one from the current size to a bigger size and one from the bigger size to the smaller size. In that case, a handy class to use is the tween sequence class, and that will allow us to run a series of tweens. So in here I can pass in tween sequence item, and I can pass in multiple tween sequence items. So this tween sequence item will run, and once that's completed, this tween sequence will run. So here we need to pass in two things. Firstly, we need to pass in the tween that we want, and then also we can pass in a weight, and this will determine the duration for each individual tween sequence item out of the whole animation. So for example, if we want to set this animation at say 40% of the total duration, we could pass in 4, and if we want to set the second one as 60% of the total duration, we could pass in 6. So this weighting will help us set a proportion for how much this animation runs. So in this case we just need 2, and now let's pass in our first tween. So we can just pass in the tween that we want by writing tween, and this has a begin and an end. Now let's write in our begin value, which is 1, so the current scale, and then let's scale this up to say 1.3, and we'll give this a weighting of 1, and in this case each weighting will be even, so we'll both give them a weighting of 1. So this will be 50% and this will be 50%. Now let's pass in a tween here. So this will start at 1.3 and then animate back down to the original size, so end will go back to 1. Now to run this we need to call .animate, and here I need to pass in an animation object. I could pass in the controller directly, but here I'll pass in a curved animation, so we can add a curve to this animation. So for the parent I'll pass in the controller, which will drive this animation, and then here we can pass in a curve, and in this case we've got a heap of different curves to choose from. I'll select bounce in and out and we'll see how that looks.
So the value that will be animated is of type double, so I'll put this in angle brackets here.
So we could also have a tween sequence of say type offset as well, if we had a different type of animation. Now let's set up the actual animation. I will replace this container with a scale transition. The scale transition is an animation widget, and that's basically going to do all the work for us. It takes in an animation of type double, so we've passed in animation. And secondly, we need to pass in a child, and that will be the actual widget that we animate. So the child will be widget.child. So this is accessing the child we pass into the stateful widget, and we're using the widget keyword here to access that passed in widget down here in the state class. Okay, so it's that easy to set up. Now we also need to kickstart the animation, and we can do that by using didUpdateWidget, which is another method on the state class. When we pass in animate to true, didUpdate will run and will automatically call the build method for us. So we can write if widget.animate is true, animation controller will run forward. So using the dot forward, this starts our animation and runs it. And this will run the animation over the 300 milliseconds. Also, before this runs, let's call animation.reset. And that's because when this animation runs forward, it will run from 0 to 1. And then if we want it to run again, we need to reset it back to 0. So that means this animation controller can run multiple times. Now that we have set up the animation, let's apply it. I'll go to Components, Grid. To apply the animation, we can right click on Tile, wrap with widget, and wrap with the bounce stateful widget we just created, so it's really easy to apply. This has two required parameters. We have child, which is the tile, so we'll animate this tile here, and also animate, which is of type bool. So I've created a variable of type bool, and we'll pass this into our animate here. So when this triggers true, it'll run the bounce animation. Now we want this bounce animation to run when the most recent letter has been entered into these grid tiles. So to get this animation to run, we can use this index here from Item Builder, which represents each of these tiles from 0 to 29, and we can compare that against current tile, the variable we created in our controller, which is also of type int and represents the most recent tile entered into these grids. So firstly, we need to listen to the current tile variable in the controller. We'll use the consumer in provider to do that. So I've wrapped the bounce widget in our consumer, and I've written controller here in angle brackets. Now import the libraries. Awesome. Now we need to change this child to a builder. I'll update this to a block body. Okay, now to trigger this animation, in here I will write so if the index of this given tile is equal to the most recent tile that was entered in, represented by current tile in the controller, then we can set animate to true. At that point in time, true will be passed into this bounce widget, and it will run this animation here. And before we run this, I'm going to cut this bool here, and I'm going to paste it in here. And the reason for that is this variable will now be created every time this builder runs, and will have a value of false unless this condition is met. So essentially now this builder will keep running and always check whether this condition is met. And therefore only the most recent grid tile will animate. Okay, now let's check this out. Hot restart. And we can see the first tile has animated by itself. And we can see we have the animation working, but it's working for the tile in front of the tile that we want. So to fix that, we need to write -1 here. And the reason is the index is starting off at 0 and the current tile is 0, so the first tile is running straight away. So a print function will show what's happening. Hot restart. And cool, we can see that the S is animating when we want it to. The G animates when we want it to. The K is animating when we want it to. And the L is animating when we want it to. So this is looking really good. Now if we look what's happening, we can see that the index is 0 and the current is 1. So we can see that when current changes to 1, i.e. we've entered in our first tile, then index equals current tile when it's -1. So 0 is equal to 1 minus 1, and so on. But we can see when we go back, the tiles are animating. But in Wordle, when the player goes backwards, the tile should not animate. So let's fix that. We can do that by going to our controller, and here in the controller we can just create a new bool, is back or enter. We'll set this to false. So this will just tell us when the user has pressed the back or enter key. So here we can set is back or enter equal to true. Likewise, when the user enters back, that's also true. Otherwise, it's false. So any other key, that will turn false. Then back in the grid, we can just add to this condition. So use and then say if this is false, so and is back or enter, not true, and this condition is met, then we want to animate. So let's remove the print function and we'll run it one more time. Okay, cool. So the bounce animation is working. Now let's go back and let's go forward. Cool. So the animation only works when we run forward. Okay, cool. So we now have this nice bounce effect set up in the project. I'm also just going to add some const here. Right click, add const modifiers. So there is the bounce, and now let's run this here. Okay, cool. So we now have a fairly similar effect. In the next video, we'll create our final animation for the app, which will run when the player correctly guesses a word.